The Johnsons were the picture of a perfect family to anyone who glanced at them from the outside. Sarah, a dedicated primary school teacher, had an infectious smile and a gentle demeanor that endeared her to students and parents alike. Mark, her husband, was a successful software engineer whose hard work had earned him a comfortable position in a prominent tech company. Together, they lived in a charming two-story house in the suburbs of Colorado, with a backyard bursting with sunflowers planted by Sarah and their 6-year-old daughter, Lily. But like the sunflowers that turned their faces to the sun each morning, Sarah began to feel she was constantly searching for light, a warmth that was missing in her marriage. Mark had always been a hardworking man. From the moment they met in college, his ambition was one of the things that drew Sarah to him. He was driven, disciplined, and focused, qualities she admired in contrast to her own creative and empathetic personality. Over the years, however, his work ethic had morphed into an almost all-consuming obsession. His career in software engineering required long hours, late-night calls, and endless problem-solving, leaving little time for family. At first, Sarah understood. Mark's work provided financial stability and allowed them to give Lily the best of everything. But as the months turned into years, the sacrifices began to take a toll. Mark's late nights at the office became the norm, and weekends were often spent with his laptop instead of with Sarah and Lily. Their once lively conversations had dwindled into brief exchanges about schedules, chores, and Lily's activities. "How was your day?" became a question asked out of habit rather than genuine curiosity. Sarah tried to fill the void by focusing on Lily and her work. She poured her energy into planning creative lessons for her students and organizing fun activities for her daughter. Baking cookies, reading bedtime stories, and creating art projects became her refuge. Yet, despite her efforts to stay busy, an ache of loneliness settled deep in her chest. She missed the Mark she had fallen in love with. The man who once surprised her with handwritten letters, who held her hand tightly during their late-night walks, and who listened intently as she shared her dreams and fears. One rainy afternoon, Sarah found herself sitting by the kitchen window, watching the raindrops race down the glass. Lily was upstairs playing, her laughter echoing faintly through the house. Sarah's gaze drifted to the empty chair across the table, Mark's chair. It had been months since they'd shared a meal together without distractions. Even when he was physically present, his mind seemed elsewhere, lost in the labyrinth of codes and deadlines. The rain outside mirrored the storm inside Sarah's heart. She loved Mark deeply, but the distance between them felt insurmountable. Every attempt to bridge the gap seemed to falter. When she suggested a weekend getaway, Mark would apologize and explain that work was too demanding. When she tried to share her feelings, he'd reassure her that things would get better, but offered no concrete steps to change. Things reached a tipping point during Lily's 6th birthday party. Sarah had spent weeks planning the event, transforming their backyard into a whimsical wonderland with fairy lights, balloons, and a handmade cake shaped like a unicorn. Friends and family gathered to celebrate, and Lily's laughter was infectious. Yet, amidst the festivities, Sarah couldn't ignore the pang in her heart when she glanced at Mark. He was standing off to the side, glued to his phone, responding to emails. Even during moments meant for joy, he couldn't disconnect from work. That night, after the guests had left and Lily was asleep, Sarah confronted him. "Mark, do you even realize how much you've been missing?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You were there physically today, but emotionally, you might as well have been at the office." Mark looked up from his phone, his brows furrowing. "Sarah, I'm doing this for us. For Lily. My work is what allows us to have this life." "What life, Mark?" she countered, her frustration boiling over. "A life where we're strangers living under the same roof? Where our daughter's most cherished memories won't include you?" Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Mark sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'll try to do better," he muttered, but Sarah wasn't convinced. She had heard those words before, and each time they were followed by no real change. In the weeks that followed, Sarah's sense of isolation deepened. She began to notice the small details that highlighted their growing distance. The way Mark barely looked up when she walked into a room, how he rarely asked about her day, and the absence of affection that had once been a cornerstone of their relationship. She felt invisible, like a ghost haunting her own home. One morning, as Sarah dropped Lily off at school, she bumped into David. He was the father of one of her students and had recently moved to the area with his son. David was warm and approachable, with a quick smile and an easy laugh. Over time, their paths crossed more frequently during school events and parent-teacher meetings. David often stayed behind to chat, sharing stories about his son or asking Sarah about her teaching methods. At first, Sarah thought nothing of their conversations. They were lighthearted and professional, a welcome break from her usual routine. But as the weeks went by, she found herself looking forward to their interactions. David had a way of making her feel valued and heard, something she hadn't felt in a long time. When he complimented her creativity in organizing a school project, she blushed, a feeling she hadn't experienced since her early days with Mark. One afternoon, as they stood by the school playground watching the children play, David turned to her and said, "You're amazing, you know that? The way you handle everything with such grace and kindness, it's inspiring." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She quickly brushed off the compliment, but his words lingered. For the first time in years, someone had seen her, really seen her. As Sarah drove home that evening, her thoughts were a whirlwind. She knew she was treading dangerous territory, but she couldn't deny the spark that David's attention had ignited within her. It wasn't just about him. It was about what he represented, a reminder of the person she used to be before life became a series of responsibilities and compromises. Back at home, Mark was in his usual spot on the couch, his laptop open and his phone buzzing with notifications. Sarah paused in the doorway, watching him for a moment. She wanted to tell him about her day, about David's compliment, about the ache in her heart that she couldn't shake. But as she opened her mouth to speak, Mark glanced up briefly and said, "Hey, can you keep it down? I'm on a call." The moment passed, and Sarah's words remained unspoken. She turned away, her heart heavy with the weight of everything left unsaid. The distance between them wasn't just physical. It was emotional, a chasm that seemed to grow wider with each passing day. And so, Sarah found herself at a crossroads, torn between loyalty to the life she had built with Mark and the yearning for something more, something she feared might never come from the man she once called her soulmate. The growing connection between Sarah and David began innocently, or so Sarah told herself. It was just a few kind words exchanged during parent-teacher meetings, a shared laugh over something the kids said, or brief chats by the school's playground. But as the weeks went by, those moments began to hold more significance for Sarah. David's attention filled a void she hadn't even realized had grown so vast. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Sarah stood by the school fence watching Lily play with her classmates, David approached. He was carrying a steaming cup of coffee and offered it to her with a warm smile. "Thought you might need this," he said. "You've been running around all day with the kids." Sarah hesitated for a moment, then accepted the cup with a soft laugh. "Thanks. You're observant, aren't you?" "It's hard not to notice someone who puts so much heart into what they do," David replied. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that Sarah felt deeply. She looked away, unsure of how to respond. Over the next few weeks, their conversations became more frequent and less formal. They began texting occasionally, first about school events and their children, then about broader topics. Sarah found herself sharing parts of her life she hadn't talked about in years, her love of painting, her struggles to balance work and home life, and the growing distance between her and Mark. David, in turn, shared his own story. He was a single father, navigating the challenges of raising his son, Max, on his own after a messy divorce. "It's not easy," he confided one evening, "but seeing Max happy makes it worth it. And having someone to talk to helps too." Sarah felt a pang of guilt every time she smiled at his messages or lingered a little longer during their conversations. She knew she was crossing a line, but she rationalized it as harmless. "It's not like we're doing anything wrong," she told herself. "We're just friends." But the boundary between friendship and something more blurred one evening after a school event. Sarah had stayed late to clean up the classroom, and David offered to help. As they worked side by side, their conversation flowed effortlessly, punctuated by laughter and moments of shared understanding. When the last chair was stacked and the room was tidy. They stood by the doorway, reluctant to leave. The school was quiet, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves outside. "You're incredible, Sarah," David said suddenly, his voice soft. "I don't think you hear that enough." Sarah's breath caught. For a moment, she felt the world pause. She knew she should step away, put distance between them, but instead, she whispered, "Thank you." David reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. The gesture was tender, intimate, and it made Sarah's heart race. She pulled back abruptly, her cheeks flushing. "I should go," she said, grabbing her bag and heading toward the door without looking back. That night, Sarah lay awake in bed, replaying the moment in her mind. She felt an overwhelming mix of emotions: excitement, guilt, confusion. Mark lay beside her, his breathing steady as he slept. She turned to look at him, her heart aching. "What am I doing?" she whispered to herself. Despite her resolve to keep her distance, Sarah found herself drawn to David again and again. They began meeting for coffee, under the guise of discussing school projects or sharing parenting advice. Each meeting felt like stepping into a world where she was truly seen and appreciated. David listened to her in a way Mark hadn't in years, and Sarah's laughter came more easily when she was with him. The turning point came on a cold winter evening. Sarah had agreed to meet David at a small cafe after school. The warm, dimly lit space was a welcome escape from the chilly wind outside. As they sat across from each other, their conversation turned deeply personal. "Do you ever feel like you've lost yourself?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like the person you used to be is just gone?" David nodded. "All the time. After my divorce, I felt like I was just going through the motions, trying to be a good dad, but forgetting who I was beyond that." He reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "But you don't have to lose yourself, Sarah. You're still in there." Sarah looked at their hands, her heart pounding. She wanted to pull away, to end this before it went any further, but she couldn't. The connection between them felt undeniable. Later that evening, as Sarah drove home, her thoughts were a chaotic swirl. She knew she was in dangerous territory, but the thought of letting go of the one person who made her feel alive again was unbearable. She parked in the driveway, sitting in the car for a long time before finally walking into the house. Mark was in the living room, his laptop open as usual. He looked up briefly and said, "You're home late." "There was a lot to do at school," Sarah replied, avoiding his eyes. Mark nodded and returned to his work, the moment passing without further comment. As the weeks went on, Sarah and David's relationship deepened. They shared stolen moments, a lingering glance, a brief touch, a shared smile. Each encounter felt like stepping closer to the edge of a precipice, and Sarah knew it was only a matter of time before she had to make a choice. One evening, David invited Sarah to his house for coffee. She hesitated but agreed, telling herself it was just a friendly visit. When she arrived, the warmth of the space and David's easy demeanor put her at ease. They talked for hours, laughing and sharing stories. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere shifted. David leaned closer, his eyes searching hers. "Sarah," he said, his voice low, "I care about you. More than I should." Sarah's breath hitched. She wanted to deny her own feelings, to walk away, but instead, she whispered, "I care about you too." The words hung in the air, and in that moment, everything changed. David closed the distance between them, and Sarah didn't stop him. The kiss was tender, filled with all the emotions they had been holding back. When they finally pulled away, Sarah felt a rush of both exhilaration and dread. "I should go," she said, standing abruptly. David didn't try to stop her, but the look in his eyes told her he didn't want her to leave. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, she knew she had crossed a line. The guilt was overwhelming, but so was the longing. She felt trapped between two worlds: the safe, familiar life she had built with Mark and the passionate, thrilling connection she shared with David. And though she didn't want to admit it, she knew the decision she faced would change everything. Sarah's life had become a delicate web of secrets, lies, and guilt. Every moment with David felt intoxicating. Yet every time she returned home, the weight of her choices pressed down on her chest like a boulder. She had crossed a line she could never uncross, and the consequences of her actions loomed over her like a storm cloud. Mark had begun noticing changes in Sarah's behavior. She was more distant, her phone always close by, and her excuses for late evenings at school grew more frequent. He tried to dismiss his suspicions, chalking them up to his own insecurities, but the gnawing feeling wouldn't leave him. One evening, as Sarah stepped out of the room to take a call, Mark glanced at her phone on the counter. A single message preview flashed across the screen. "David, I can't stop thinking about you." Mark's heart sank. He felt a surge of anger, betrayal, and confusion all at once. When Sarah returned, he couldn't hold back any longer. "Who's David?" he asked, his voice steady but strained. Sarah froze, the color draining from her face. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. The silence was deafening. "Sarah, I'm asking you a question," Mark pressed, his voice rising. "Who is he? And don't tell me he's just some parent at school." "I saw the message." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she realized there was no escaping the truth. "Mark, I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I felt so alone." Mark stared at her. Disbelief etched across his face. "Alone? Sarah, I've been working my ass off to give us everything we need. How could you do this?" "It wasn't about you," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "It was about me. I felt invisible, like we were just coexisting instead of being together. And David, he made me feel seen again." The room fell silent as the weight of her confession settled between them. Mark's hands clenched into fists, not out of anger towards Sarah, but out of sheer frustration and hurt. "How long?" he finally asked. "A few months," Sarah admitted, her voice barely audible. Mark turned away, running a hand through his hair. He felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. The woman he loved, the mother of his child, had betrayed him in the most profound way. But amidst the hurt, there was a part of him that wanted to understand, to salvage what they had. The next few days were a blur of tense silence and avoided conversations. Sarah stayed in the guest room, giving Mark space to process everything. Lily, too young to grasp the situation, noticed the shift in the household and clung to Sarah more than usual. Mark spent his nights replaying their relationship in his mind, searching for the moments where things had gone wrong. He realized how much he had prioritized work over his family, how he had missed the subtle signs of Sarah's unhappiness. But could that justify what she had done? One evening, Mark broke the silence. "We need to talk," he said, standing in the doorway of the guest room. Sarah nodded, her eyes red from days of crying. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where they had shared so many memories, now a battlefield of raw emotions. "Do you love him?" Mark asked, his voice trembling. Sarah hesitated, then shook her head. "No, I thought I did, but it wasn't real. It was an escape." Mark let out a heavy breath, relief mingling with his lingering pain. "Do you still love me?" Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she reached for his hand. "Yes, more than anything. I know I've hurt you, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But I love you, Mark. I'm so sorry." Mark pulled his hand away, his expression conflicted. "I need time, Sarah. I don't know if I can just forgive and forget. But for Lily's sake, we need to figure this out. Together." They decided to attend couples therapy, a step that neither of them found easy, but both agreed was necessary. In their sessions, they unraveled years of unspoken frustrations and unmet needs. Mark admitted how his work had become a shield, allowing him to avoid dealing with the emotional intimacy their marriage required. Sarah, in turn, confessed how her loneliness had grown into resentment, making her vulnerable to David's attention. Through therapy, they began to rebuild their connection, brick by brick. They started setting aside time for each other, whether it was a simple walk after dinner or a dedicated date night every week. Mark made a conscious effort to leave work at the office, and Sarah found ways to communicate her feelings without letting them fester. But the road to healing was far from smooth. There were moments of doubt, arguments that reopened old wounds, and nights where one or both of them questioned if they could truly move past what had happened. Yet, for every step backward, they found a way to take 2 steps forward. One evening, As they sat on the couch watching Lily play with her toys, Mark reached for Sarah's hand. "I want to believe we can make this work," he said. "But it has to be both of us, Sarah. We both have to choose this, every day." Sarah squeezed his hand, her eyes meeting his. "I'm choosing us, Mark. Every day. I'll do whatever it takes." Months later, the scars of their past were still there, but they no longer defined their relationship. They had learned to lean on each other, to prioritize their family, and to communicate openly. Sarah ended all contact with David, focusing instead on strengthening her bond with Mark. Their marriage wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was a testament to the power of forgiveness and the resilience of love. And as they stood together, watching Lily's laughter fill the air, they knew they had chosen the harder path, but also the one that made them stronger. Because sometimes love wasn't about never falling. It was about finding the courage to rise again, together.